October 7th, 1943, 22,000 feet above Wake Island, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Butch Voris rolled his F6F Hellcat into a shallow dive, his gloved hand resting lightly on the stick as he tracked a Mitsubishi Zero through his gunsight. The Zero pilot was good, weaving through scattered clouds, trying to shake the American fighter that had latched onto his tail. But Voris wasn't worried about losing him. The Hellcat had the speed, the climb rate, the endurance, and when the moment came, it had something else entirely. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, synchronized, loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing incendiary and tracer rounds, 4,800 rounds per minute of combined fire that could saw an aircraft in half. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Voris waited. Patience was easier when you knew what your weapons could do. The Zero pulled up sharply, attempting a climbing spiral that would have left earlier American fighters struggling. The Hellcat followed effortlessly, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine pouring out 2,000 horsepower. Voris eased the stick back, keeping the Zero centered in his illuminated reticle. The range closed. 600 yards, 500, 400. At 350 yards, Voris pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns fired simultaneously. The sound inside the cockpit was a hammering roar, even through his leather helmet. Bright tracers arced across the sky, converging on the Zero-like fingers of fire. The first rounds struck the Zero's left wing root, then the fuselage, then the engine cowling. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Zero's wing separated completely at the root, tumbling away in a spray of aluminum fragments. The fuel tank, unprotected by any self-sealing mechanism, erupted in an orange fireball. The fuselage, its structural integrity destroyed by 50 caliber rounds that punched through thin aluminum-like paper, began to disintegrate in mid-air. From trigger press to total destruction, less than 2 seconds. Voris released the trigger and pulled up, banking away from the falling wreckage. His guns had fired perhaps 100 rounds total. He still had over 1,400 rounds remaining. Enough ammunition to destroy 13 more aircraft, if his aim stayed true, and if targets presented themselves. Below, in the waters off Wake Island, a Japanese pilot who had witnessed the encounter from his own Zero's cockpit sat frozen at his controls. He had watched the entire engagement, watched the American fighter close with mechanical inevitability, watched the brief flash of gunfire, watched his squadron mate's aircraft literally come apart in the sky. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai would survive the war to write extensively about his combat experiences. His report on this period would include a chilling observation. We were fighting with swords. The Americans had brought machine guns. The firepower revolution that doomed Japanese naval aviation did not happen by accident. It was the culmination of hard lessons learned in blood over the first 2 years of the Pacific War, translated into engineering specifications that would fundamentally alter the balance of air combat. To understand what the Hellcat's 650 caliber guns represented, you have to understand what American pilots had been fighting with before, and why it was inadequate. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the standard U.S. Navy carrier fighter was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It was a solid, dependable aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment and bring pilots home. But its armament was problematic. Early F4, F3 variants carried 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 2 in each wing, with approximately 430 rounds per gun. 4 guns firing 50 caliber rounds sounds formidable, and against unarmored or lightly constructed aircraft, it was adequate. But against the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, with its incredible maneuverability and the tactical doctrine that emphasized brief, deflection shooting opportunities, 4 guns proved insufficient. Hit probability in aerial combat is brutally low. Studies of gun camera footage from the Pacific War revealed that even experienced pilots achieved hits with only about 2% of rounds fired in combat conditions. The target is maneuvering violently. The shooter is maneuvering violently. Range is constantly changing. Deflection angles require complex lead calculations that must be performed instinctively in fractions of a second. Atmospheric conditions affect bullet trajectories. The stress of combat degrades fine motor control and cognitive function. Under these conditions, more guns meant more rounds in the air during any given firing opportunity, which meant higher probability of scoring damaging hits. The Wildcat's 4 guns, while better than the rifle-caliber weapons that equipped some early war fighters, weren't enough. Combat reports from early engagements consistently mentioned the same problem. American pilots would get brief firing opportunities against Zeros. They would see strikes on target, and the Zero would continue fighting. The 50 caliber rounds were punching holes, certainly, but not enough holes in critical areas to bring the aircraft down. Zero pilots, flying unarmored aircraft with unprotected fuel tanks, would sometimes absorb 20 or 30 hits and survive, simply because most rounds passed through empty space in the aircraft's structure without hitting anything vital. This problem was exacerbated by ammunition capacity limitations. The Wildcat's 430 rounds per gun gave each weapon approximately 18 seconds of continuous fire before running dry. But no pilot fires continuously. Combat involves brief bursts, typically 1 to 2 seconds each, as fleeting firing opportunities present themselves. Still, in a prolonged engagement involving multiple opponents, Wildcat pilots found themselves running low on ammunition before the fight was over. Running out of ammunition in a dogfight with Zeros still in the air was a death sentence. The solution seemed obvious: more guns, more ammunition. But aircraft design involves constant trade-offs. More guns mean more weight. More ammunition means even more weight. Weight reduces performance, and performance keeps you alive. The Bureau of Aeronautics and Grumman engineering teams spent months in 1942 analyzing combat reports and trying to determine the optimal armament package for the next-generation fighter. They studied gun camera footage frame by frame. They interviewed returning pilots extensively. They conducted ballistic tests against captured Japanese aircraft components. They performed structural analysis on Zeros that had been shot down and recovered. The data painted a clear picture. The Zero's construction used thin aluminum skin over minimalist internal structure. It had no armor protection. It had unprotected fuel tanks that would ignite readily when pierced. It was, structurally speaking, a fragile aircraft that could be destroyed with concentrated fire. But concentrated fire was the key phrase. Getting enough rounds into critical areas during brief firing opportunities required volume of fire that 4 guns simply couldn't deliver. The engineering team ran calculations. 6 50 caliber guns would provide 50% more rounds in the air during any given burst. That translated to 50% higher hit probability, all else being equal. More importantly, 6 guns meant that even if 1 or 2 guns jammed, a common occurrence in the harsh conditions of carrier operations and high-G combat maneuvers, the fighter would still have substantial firepower available. The weight penalty was significant. Each Browning M2 machine gun weighed 64 pounds. Adding 2 more guns meant 128 pounds. The ammunition load they planned, 400 rounds per gun for the inboard guns and 375 rounds per gun for the outboard guns, added hundreds more pounds. The ammunition feed systems, gun mounts, and structural reinforcement to handle the recoil forces of 6 heavy machine guns added still more weight. Total armament system weight approached 1,500 pounds, not counting the guns themselves. For comparison, the Zero's entire armament package, 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons with limited ammunition, weighed substantially less. But Grumman and the Navy made a calculated decision. The Hellcat would have the power to carry that weight. The R2800 engine's 2,000 horsepower could overcome the performance penalty, and the combat advantage of overwhelming firepower would be worth any slight reduction in maneuverability or climb rate. They were right. When the first production F6F Hellcats reached fleet squadrons in early 1943, Pilots were immediately impressed by the armament. 6 guns provided firepower that felt almost excessive. Test pilots reported that firing all 6 guns simultaneously produced enough recoil to noticeably slow the aircraft. The combined recoil force of 6 heavy machine guns creating a perceptible deceleration. The sound was different too. 4 guns produced a steady hammering. 6 guns created a deeper, more visceral roar, like tearing canvas, but amplified to window-rattling intensity. The psychological impact on American pilots was profound. After months of fighting in Wildcats, where every firing opportunity had to be perfect because ammunition was limited and 4 guns might not be enough, Hellcat pilots felt like they had overwhelming force at their fingertips. You could afford to take longer shots. You could fire at targets that would have been marginal with 4 guns. You could engage multiple opponents in sequence without worrying about running dry. The first major combat test of the Hellcat's firepower came in August 1943 during strikes against Marcus Island. Fighting Squadron 5, operating from USS Yorktown, encountered Japanese aircraft over the target. The engagement was brief but conclusive. Hellcats destroyed multiple Japanese aircraft with burst lengths that would have been inadequate with lighter armament. 1 Japanese fighter disintegrated after absorbing fire for less than a second. Another exploded when 50 caliber incendiary rounds ignited its fuel tanks. The after-action reports were enthusiastic. Pilots described firepower that felt almost unfair. But the true test would come when Hellcats met Zeros in large-scale engagements where Japanese pilots could observe and report what they were facing. That moment arrived over the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. The Battle of Tarawa, primarily remembered as a brutal amphibious assault, also featured sustained air combat as Japanese forces attempted to defend the island. Zeros from bases in the Marshalls engaged Hellcats, providing air cover for the invasion fleet. The Japanese pilots had faced American fighters before. They knew the Wildcats' capabilities and limitations. They had developed tactics that exploited the Wildcats' relatively light armament, using the Zero's superior maneuverability to avoid prolonged exposure to enemy fire. Against the Hellcat, those tactics failed catastrophically. Japanese formation leaders reported that American fighters now possessed firepower that made even brief defensive mistakes fatal. A Zero pilot who exposed his aircraft for 2 seconds while executing an evasive maneuver would find his plane shredded, not damaged, but destroyed. Wing structures would fail. Control surfaces would be shot away. Engines would seize as 50 caliber rounds punched through cylinder heads and crankshafts. The weight of fire was simply overwhelming. 1 Japanese pilot, Petty Officer First Class Takeo Tanimizu, survived an encounter with a Hellcat over Tarawa despite taking multiple hits. His after-action report, captured later when he was taken prisoner, described the experience. The American fighter fired at me from perhaps 400 meters. I attempted a left brake, a maneuver that has always forced American fighters to overshoot. I saw the tracers coming. They seemed like a solid stream, not individual bullets. Hits all along my right wing and fuselage. My canopy shattered. The engine began losing power immediately. I managed to reach the water and ditch, but my aircraft was no longer controllable. I had faced American fighters many times before. This was different. The volume of fire they can deliver now is terrifying. What Tanimizu had experienced was approximately 2 seconds of fire from a Hellcat's 6 guns. In that brief interval, roughly 160 rounds had been directed at his aircraft. Perhaps 15 to 20 had actually struck, given the miss rates inherent in air combat. But 15 50 caliber rounds hitting an unarmored fighter were more than enough to render it unflyable. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was not a precision instrument. It was a hammer. Developed in the 1920s by John Browning, the M2 fired a half-inch diameter bullet weighing approximately 1 2/3 ounces at a muzzle velocity of about 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy of a single round was enormous, roughly 14,000 foot-pounds, enough to punch through light armor at typical combat ranges. The ammunition mixture carried by Hellcats typically consisted of one armor-piercing incendiary round for every 4 or 5 ball rounds, with additional tracer rounds for aiming reference. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds were particularly devastating against aircraft. The bullet consisted of a hardened steel core surrounded by an incendiary mixture. When the round struck a target, the hard core would penetrate, and then the incendiary compound would ignite from the friction and heat of impact, starting fires inside the target structure. Against the Zero, with its unprotected fuel tanks and lack of fire suppression systems, armor-piercing incendiary rounds were catastrophic. A single API round penetrating a fuel tank would ignite the gasoline almost instantly. The resulting fire would spread rapidly through the aircraft's structure, consuming the fabric-covered control surfaces and weakening the already minimal structural members. Zeros hit by sustained .50 caliber fire didn't just get damaged, they burned. Combat film from Hellcat gun cameras, reviewed extensively by intelligence officers throughout 1944, showed a consistent pattern. Brief firing pass, rounds striking the Zero, almost immediate appearance of smoke or flame. Rapid structural failure or fire consuming the aircraft. The time from first hit to catastrophic failure averaged less than 5 seconds. Japanese pilots began reporting this pattern to their intelligence officers with increasing urgency. The Americans, they said, had developed some kind of explosive ammunition that could destroy a Zero with just a few hits. Intelligence analysis dismissed this at first, assuming combat stress was causing pilots to exaggerate. But as reports accumulated, investigators began taking the claims seriously. They examined wreckage from Zeros that had been shot down and recovered. What they found was worse than explosive ammunition. They found evidence of ordinary .50 caliber hits, but in such quantity and concentration that the cumulative effect was indeed explosive. 6 guns firing together could place 15 to 20 rounds into a small area of an aircraft structure in less than 2 seconds. That level of damage concentration exceeded anything Japanese aircraft had been designed to withstand. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. For the first 2 years of the Pacific War, Zero pilots had enjoyed a significant moral advantage. They flew what was arguably the world's best carrier fighter. They had superior training. They had combat experience. They understood that their aircraft's maneuverability could compensate for any slight disadvantage in speed or protection. Facing American fighters had been challenging, certainly, but not hopeless. The Hellcat changed that calculation fundamentally. Now, Japanese pilots knew that any encounter with the American fighter carried a high probability of death. Even if they could outturn the Hellcat, which they could at low speeds, the American pilot only needed 2 seconds of firing opportunity to destroy them utterly. 2 seconds. 1 mistake, 1 moment of exposure. Death. This psychological shift manifested in combat reports throughout late 1943 and into 1944. Japanese pilots became more defensive, more cautious, less willing to press attacks. Formation leaders who had previously employed aggressive tactics began emphasizing survival over victory. The tactical guidance that reached frontline units by early 1944 was stark. Avoid prolonged engagement with F6F fighters. Hit and run if possible, escape if not. But escaping from a Hellcat was nearly impossible for a Zero pilot. The American fighter had superior speed, superior climb rate, and superior dive characteristics. A Zero pilot who broke off combat would simply be run down and destroyed. The only chance was to never enter combat in the first place, which defeated the entire purpose of fighter operations. By the spring of 1944, Japanese naval aviation faced a crisis that extended far beyond tactics or training. The Hellcat's 650 caliber guns represented a weapons system that Japanese fighters simply had no effective counter for. You couldn't armor against it because the Zero lacked armor. You couldn't outturn it because Hellcat pilots refused to engage in turning fights. You couldn't outrun it because the Hellcat was faster. You couldn't escape it vertically because the Hellcat climbed better. The firepower imbalance was absolute and admitted no solution within existing Japanese design philosophy or industrial capabilities. The Japanese Naval Air Technical Staff understood this clearly by mid-1944. They had examined captured Hellcat components, interviewed surviving pilots extensively, and analyzed combat results statistically. Their conclusions were documented in reports that reached the highest levels of military command. The F6F's armament, the reports stated, represents a paradigm shift in fighter combat. 6 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously create a damage density against which our current aircraft have no defense. The Zero's light construction, designed to maximize maneuverability and range, becomes a fatal liability when exposed to this volume of fire. Even brief hits are catastrophic. Recommendations included immediate development of fighters with heavier structure, armor protection, and equivalent or superior armament. But recommendations written in mid-1944 were academic exercises. Japan's industrial capacity was already straining to produce adequate numbers of existing designs. Developing entirely new aircraft with heavier construction and armament would require time, resources, and manufacturing capacity that simply didn't exist. The analysis also noted something that Japanese engineers found particularly frustrating. The American solution was not technically sophisticated. 650 caliber guns was not cutting-edge technology. It was simply adequate guns in adequate numbers. The engineering was straightforward. The manufacturing was well within American industrial capabilities. There was nothing about the Hellcat's armament that Japanese industry couldn't theoretically duplicate, given sufficient resources and time. But that was precisely the problem. Resources and time were luxuries Japan no longer possessed. American submarines had severed supply lines from resource-rich territories. Allied bombing was beginning to target Japanese industrial facilities. The skilled workforce was being depleted by military conscription and combat losses. Even if Japanese engineers designed a perfect counter to the Hellcat, producing it in meaningful numbers was becoming impossible. The firepower disparity would only worsen as the war continued. By late 1944, late-model Hellcats were appearing with the option to replace 2 of the inboard 50 caliber guns with 20mm cannons, giving them 4 50 caliber guns plus 2 20mm cannons. This mixed armament provided even more devastating hitting power, particularly against larger aircraft like bombers, though most pilots preferred the 650 caliber configuration for its superior ammunition capacity and reliability. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would demonstrate exactly what the Hellcat's firepower could accomplish when deployed in strength against Japanese carrier aviation. But before examining that climactic battle, it's important to understand the technical details of how 650 caliber guns actually worked in combat and why they were so much more effective than earlier armament solutions. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun mounted in the Hellcat's wings was a refined version of a weapon that had entered service in 1933. By 1943, when it became the Hellcat's primary armament, the M2 had evolved into perhaps the most reliable aircraft gun in the world. Each gun weighed 64 pounds and was 35 inches long. Mounted 3 to a wing, the guns were positioned with careful attention to convergence patterns. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Convergence refers to the point in space where rounds from wing-mounted guns cross each other's paths. The Hellcat's guns were typically converged at approximately 1,000 feet, meaning that rounds from all 6 guns would intersect at a point roughly 1,000 feet ahead of the aircraft. At that range, the pattern of fire created a cone of destruction, approximately 6 feet in diameter, where all 6 streams of bullets crossed. Pilots were trained to open fire at ranges between 1,000 and 300 feet, taking advantage of the convergence zone where hit probability was highest. Closer than 300 feet risked collision with the target or debris from its destruction. Farther than 1,000 feet meant the bullet streams were spreading apart, reducing hit density and making precision aiming more critical. The ammunition feed system was a marvel of mechanical engineering. Each gun received rounds from ammunition boxes mounted in the wing structure behind it. The belt-fed system used disintegrating links that separated as rounds were chambered, with spent links ejected through ports in the wing's underside. The entire feed system had to function reliably while the aircraft maneuvered at high G-forces, in temperatures ranging from -40 degrees at altitude to over 100 degrees on the flight deck, and in conditions where gun vibration, aircraft vibration, and combat maneuvering all conspired to cause jams. Grumman engineers had spent months refining the feed system geometry to minimize jam rates. The result was a system that could sustain fire even during violent combat maneuvers that would choke other weapons. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats frequently reported that American guns never seemed to jam, a testament to the reliability engineering that had gone into the armament system. The rate of fire for each gun was approximately 800 rounds per minute, though combat conditions could cause minor variations. With 6 guns firing, that translated to 4,800 rounds per minute combined. To put that in perspective, in a 2-second burst, a Hellcat would fire 160 rounds total. In a more typical 1-second burst, 80 rounds. Even a half-second trigger press sent 40 rounds downrange. The ammunition load was carefully calculated. The 4 inboard guns, 2 per wing, carried 400 rounds each. The 2 outboard guns carried 375 rounds each. Total ammunition capacity was 2,400 rounds, distributed as 1,600 rounds for the inboard guns and 750 rounds for the outboard guns. This provided approximately 19 seconds of continuous fire, if all guns were firing, though no pilot ever fired continuously for that long. In practice, pilots fired in bursts of 1/2 to 2 seconds, with the typical combat engagement involving 4 to 8 bursts before the target was destroyed or escaped. With ammunition for approximately 19 seconds of total fire time, a Hellcat pilot could theoretically engage 9 to 10 targets before running dry, assuming 1 to 2 second bursts per target. Real combat rarely matched theoretical calculations, but the point remained. Hellcat pilots had abundant ammunition for extended engagements. The psychological impact of hearing 6 heavy machine guns fire cannot be understated. Inside the cockpit, even with leather helmet and ear protection, the sound was overwhelming. The guns were mounted in the wings just a few feet from the pilot's head, and when all 6 fired, the cockpit filled with a hammering roar that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. The aircraft would shudder from recoil, and the smell of gun smoke would seep into the cockpit within seconds. For the pilot, it was sensory confirmation of devastating firepower being unleashed. For the target pilot, the experience was even more traumatic. The sound of 50 caliber rounds passing nearby is distinctive, a supersonic crack as the bullet breaks the sound barrier, followed by a deeper thud as it penetrates structure. Multiply that by 15 to 20 hits in 2 seconds, and the effect is overwhelming. Japanese pilots described it as sounding like their aircraft was being hit by hammers, a rapid-fire drumming that coincided with the aircraft being torn apart around them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The most detailed Japanese analysis of the Hellcat's firepower came not from combat reports, but from ground examination of Hellcats that had been forced down in Japanese-controlled territory, or shot down at low altitude where wreckage could be recovered relatively intact. By mid-1944, Japanese intelligence had assembled a composite picture of the Hellcat's armament system from multiple sources. They understood the gun type, the ammunition capacity, the feed system design, and the convergence pattern. What frustrated Japanese analysts was that understanding the system didn't suggest any viable countermeasures. The guns themselves were not particularly advanced. The Browning M2 design dated to the 1920s. The ammunition was conventional ball, armor-piercing, and incendiary types that had been in service for years. There was nothing exotic or secret about any component of the system. The devastating effectiveness came purely from having 6 of these guns firing simultaneously with adequate ammunition and mounted in an aircraft that could bring them to bear effectively. Japanese engineers proposed several potential responses. The most obvious was to increase armor protection on Japanese fighters, to the point where they could survive 50 caliber hits long enough to disengage or counterattack. But analysis quickly showed this approach was impractical. To provide meaningful protection against 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds at typical combat ranges would require armor plate at least 3/8 of an inch thick for critical areas and 1/4 inch plate for less vital regions. Installing such protection on a Zero would add approximately 600 to 700 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight. That weight penalty would reduce climb rate by roughly 15%, reduce maximum speed by 20 knots, decrease range by approximately 200 miles, and significantly degrade the maneuverability that was the Zero's primary combat advantage. The resulting aircraft would be slower than a Hellcat, climb worse than a Hellcat, possess less range than a Hellcat, and lack the maneuverability advantage that was supposed to compensate for all those deficiencies. In short, adding adequate armor to a Zero would create an aircraft inferior to the Hellcat in every performance category while still being more lightly armed. That was not a solution. It was surrender disguised as engineering. Another proposed response was to increase Japanese fighter armament to match or exceed the Hellcat's firepower. This approach seemed more promising initially. Japanese fighters already mounted 20mm cannons, which delivered more hitting power per round than 50 caliber machine guns. If Japanese fighters increased their cannon armament from 2 guns to 4 or 6, they could potentially match or exceed the Hellcat's destructive capability. But this proposal also founded on practical considerations. Japanese 20mm cannons, whether the Type 99 used on the Zero or variants used on other fighters, were larger and heavier than American 50 caliber guns. Each cannon weighed approximately 90 pounds, compared to 64 pounds for a Browning M2. More critically, the ammunition was much heavier and bulkier. 20mm rounds weighed roughly twice what 50 caliber rounds weighed, and they were physically larger, requiring more space for storage. Installing 4 or 6 20mm cannons on a fighter would require massive structural modifications to handle the weight and recoil forces. The ammunition capacity would be severely limited by space and weight constraints, probably to 60 to 100 rounds per gun instead of the 300 to 400 rounds per gun that Hellcats enjoyed. And the added weight would, once again, degrade the aircraft's performance to the point where it couldn't compete with American fighters. There was also a manufacturing constraint. Japanese aviation ordnance production was already struggling to provide adequate quantities of existing weapons. Doubling or tripling the number of cannons per aircraft would require a corresponding increase in production that Japanese industry couldn't achieve. The machine tools, skilled workers, and raw materials necessary to scale up cannon production simply weren't available. A third proposed response focused on tactics rather than hardware. If Japanese fighters couldn't match the Hellcat's firepower or survive its guns, perhaps they could employ tactics that minimized exposure to that firepower while maximizing their own weapons' effectiveness. This approach led to recommendations that Japanese pilots should avoid frontal attacks against Hellcats, where the American fighters' 6 guns would be most devastating, and instead attack from the rear quarter at close range, where even limited Japanese armament could potentially achieve kills. But tactical recommendations founded on the same problem that had plagued every other proposed solution: the Hellcat's overall performance superiority. Japanese pilots couldn't dictate engagement terms because the Hellcat was faster, climbed better, and could disengage at will. Hellcat pilots simply refused to cooperate with Japanese tactical preferences. If Japanese fighters tried to maneuver for rear quarter attacks, Hellcat pilots would extend away using their speed advantage, gain altitude, then attack from above at high speed, firing a burst and zooming away before Japanese fighters could respond. The fundamental problem was that 650 caliber guns weren't effective in isolation. They were effective as part of an integrated weapons platform that combined adequate firepower with performance superiority and pilot protection. The Hellcat could survive long enough to bring its guns to bear. It could maneuver to achieve firing position, and it could deliver enough rounds to destroy targets reliably. Japanese fighters lacked one or more of those crucial elements. By late 1944, Japanese tactical doctrine had essentially given up on, defeating Hellcats in conventional air combat. New guidelines emphasized that fighter pilots should avoid engagement with F6F aircraft whenever possible, focusing instead on attacking bombers and ground attack aircraft that were less dangerous opponents. When engagement with Hellcats was unavoidable, Japanese pilots were instructed to make one firing pass and then disengage immediately, using clouds, terrain, or altitude to break contact before the American fighters could counterattack. These were not the tactics of an air force that believed it could win. These were survival tactics, intended to minimize losses rather than achieve victory. The June 19, 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened when Japanese naval aviation, despite knowing exactly what they faced, had to fight Hellcats in strength. The Japanese mobile fleet, built around 9 aircraft carriers, launched multiple strikes against American Task Force, 58 in an attempt to destroy the carrier force supporting the Marianas invasion. The Japanese committed approximately 373 aircraft to these strikes, including every Zero and other fighter type they could put in the air. Opposing them were 15 American carriers deploying approximately 450 F6F Hellcats, along with dive bombers and torpedo planes. The resulting battle would be known to history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that reflected the one-sided nature of the air combat. Japanese strike groups, detected by American radar while still far from the fleet, were intercepted by waves of Hellcats. The American fighters, vectored to optimal intercept positions by fighter direction officers using radar data, arrived at altitude with speed and position advantage. The slaughter began immediately. Hellcats dove through Japanese formations, 6 guns firing, and Zeros exploded, burned, or disintegrated. Japanese pilots, many of them relatively inexperienced replacements for veterans lost in previous battles, found themselves in exactly the situation their training had warned them to avoid, a close-range combat with Hellcats that had every advantage. The result was massacre. The first Japanese strike wave, 69 aircraft, lost 42 planes before reaching the American fleet. Only 42 out of 69 aircraft even survived long enough to attack, and of those, most were so badly damaged or disoriented that their attacks were ineffective. The second wave, 107 aircraft, suffered even worse. 97 planes were destroyed. Only 10 made it back to their carriers. The third and fourth waves fared no better. By the end of the day, Japan had lost approximately 300 aircraft, the vast majority destroyed by Hellcats. American losses were 29 aircraft, with many pilots recovered from the ocean by rescue submarines and destroyers. The kill ratio for the day was approximately 10-1, with Hellcats accounting for the overwhelming majority of American victories. Post-battle analysis by both sides focused intensely on what had happened. American after-action reports credited superior tactics, excellent radar vectoring, well-trained pilots, and the Hellcats' performance advantages. But nearly every combat report mentioned the 650 caliber guns specifically. Pilots described targets that exploded after brief bursts. They described firing at one target, destroying it, then immediately engaging a second and destroying it with ammunition to spare. They described how the volume of fire made even low-probability shots worth taking, because enough rounds were in the air that some would hit even at extended range or difficult deflection angles. Japanese analysis was more sobering. Surviving pilots reported that they had followed doctrine, attempted to avoid prolonged engagement, tried to make single firing passes and escape. But the Hellcats had been everywhere, diving from above, attacking from the sides, pursuing fleeing aircraft, and always firing those 6 devastating guns that turned aircraft into debris in seconds. Commander Takeo Shibata, one of the strike leaders who survived the day, submitted a report that circulated to the highest levels of Japanese naval command. His conclusion was bleak. We cannot continue to contest air superiority with the Americans. Their fighters are too numerous, too powerful, and too well armed. Our pilots are brave, but bravery is not sufficient when the material imbalance is so extreme. We watched our formations being destroyed. We watched our most skilled pilots being killed. The American guns fire like rivers of metal. There is no defense. There is no counter. There is only death. The Philippine Sea Battle marked the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force. The pilots lost that day were irreplaceable, their skill built over years of training that Japan could no longer provide to new aviators. The aircraft lost were equally difficult to replace, with Japanese production struggling to keep pace with losses. But perhaps most crushing was the psychological impact. Japanese naval aviators now knew with absolute certainty that flying against Hellcats was likely to be fatal. The 650 caliber guns, more than any other single factor, had destroyed Japanese pilots' will to fight. You could order men into combat against superior numbers. You could order them into combat against skilled opponents. You could even order them into combat where survival was unlikely. But ordering men into combat where death was near certain and quick, where their aircraft would be torn apart before they could react, where no amount of skill or courage could compensate for the material disadvantage they faced, that destroyed morale in ways that no amount of propaganda could rebuild. By late 1944, Japanese fighters were being husbanded carefully, held back for decisive battles that never came, because Japanese commanders understood that sending them against Hellcat-equipped American carrier groups was simply feeding pilots into a meat grinder. The few encounters that did occur followed the same pattern: brief, violent, one-sided. American pilots would often return to their carriers with most of their ammunition unexpended, having destroyed their targets with the first burst. The introduction of the F6F variant in mid-1944, with options for mixed armament including two 20mm cannons and 450 caliber guns, gave Hellcat pilots even more firepower options. Most pilots preferred the 650 caliber configuration for its ammunition capacity and reliability, but those who flew the mixed armament version reported that it was devastatingly effective against larger aircraft and could destroy fighters with even shorter bursts than the all-gun configuration. Japanese intelligence reports from this period make for grim reading. They document, with engineering precision, exactly why Japanese fighters were being destroyed so readily. They catalogue the Hellcat's specifications, analyse its tactics, examine wreckage from shot-down American fighters, and interview captured American pilots. And every report reaches the same conclusion. The armament disparity, particularly the 650 caliber guns, represents an unsolvable problem within existing Japanese industrial and technological constraints. One particularly detailed report from November 1944, prepared by the Navy Air Technical Arsenal at Yokosuka, included ballistic testing results. Japanese engineers had obtained 50 caliber ammunition samples from various sources and conducted firing tests against Zero structural components. The results confirmed what combat pilots had been reporting. A single 50 caliber armor-piercing round could penetrate a Zero's wing spar at combat ranges. 3 to 5 hits in the wing root area could cause structural failure. 7 to 10 hits to the fuselage would destroy flight controls or fuel systems. 15 to 20 hits anywhere on the aircraft would render it unflyable, and the Hellcat could deliver 15 to 20 hits in under 2 seconds. The report concluded with a recommendation that was both sensible and impossible to implement. Japan needed to develop fighters with fundamentally different design priorities, accepting weight penalties for protection and firepower, even at the cost of maneuverability and range. But such fighters would take years to develop and produce, years Japan did not have. The final months of the war saw Japanese aviation increasingly desperate. With conventional fighters proving ineffective against Hellcats and other American aircraft, Japan turned to tactics that didn't require surviving the encounter. The kamikaze program, which became increasingly prominent from October 1944 onward, was in part a recognition that Japanese pilots could not defeat American fighters in air combat. If achieving kill ratios was impossible, at least aircraft could be used as guided weapons, requiring only that the pilot survive long enough to reach the target. Even kamikaze attacks, however, had to contend with Hellcat combat air patrols. American carriers by late 1944 maintained continuous fighter coverage, with Hellcats stationed at various altitudes and distances from the fleet, specifically to intercept incoming threats. Kamikaze aircraft, typically obsolete fighters or dive bombers loaded with explosives and fuel, were easy targets for the Hellcats. The 650 caliber guns that had proven so devastating against maneuvering fighters in combat were equally effective against kamikaze aircraft, making straight-line runs toward targets. Combat reports from 1945 describe Hellcat pilots intercepting kamikaze formations and destroying multiple aircraft in single engagements. The abundant ammunition capacity meant pilots could engage numerous targets without running dry. The destructive power of the guns meant brief bursts were sufficient to set suicide aircraft ablaze or destroy them outright. One Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, developed a fighter division tactic specifically for killing kamikazes in quantity, positioning 4 Hellcats in a mutually supporting formation that could bring 2450 caliber guns to bear on approaching threats. The effectiveness was extraordinary. Valencia's division would achieve 46 confirmed kills over several months of operations, with most being kamikaze aircraft destroyed before they could reach American ships. The 6-gun armament was crucial to this success. With less firepower, the tactics wouldn't have been viable because pilots would run out of ammunition before destroying enough threats. With the Hellcat's abundant ammunition and devastating hitting power, the system worked brutally well. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the F6F Hellcat had compiled a combat record that remains unmatched in American naval aviation history. 5,163 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 19-1. More fighter aces produced than any other American aircraft. These statistics reflected many factors: pilot training, tactics, radar direction, numerical superiority, and overall aircraft performance. But at the heart of that success was a simple fact. 650 caliber machine guns, firing 4,800 rounds per minute, could destroy any Japanese aircraft in under 2 seconds of sustained fire. That reality, established in combat over 2 years and thousands of engagements, had fundamentally altered the balance of air power in the Pacific. Japanese pilots who survived the war, when interviewed decades later, consistently mentioned the Hellcat's guns when discussing why the air war turned so decisively against Japan. Saburo Sakai, who had witnessed that first devastating engagement over Wake Island in October 1943 and survived until war's end, put it most succinctly in his memoir, "We flew the finest fighter in the world in 1941. We had superior training, superior tactics, superior experience. And for 18 months, we dominated the Pacific skies. Then the Hellcat arrived with its 6 machine guns, and suddenly we were the ones being hunted. Not because we had become less skilled, but because the Americans had learned what was needed to kill us reliably. 6 guns, 4,800 rounds per minute. 2 seconds of fire, and you were dead. It didn't matter how skilled you were or how maneuverable your aircraft was. If the American pilot got those 2 seconds, you died. And the Hellcat's performance meant American pilots got those 2 seconds whenever they wanted them. The evolution from 4 guns to 6 guns seems like a minor change when described in specification sheets. 2 additional machine guns, 50% more firepower on paper, but in combat reality, that change represented the difference between hitting targets and destroying them, between firing multiple bursts and destroying targets with single bursts, between running out of ammunition mid-engagement and having abundant reserves for multiple targets. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun would remain in U.S. military service long after World War II ended, serving in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Modern versions are still in use today, more than 9 decades after John Browning's original design. But the gun never achieved more perfect application than when 6 of them were installed in an F6F Hellcat's wings, supported by a fighter platform that could bring them to bear with devastating effectiveness. Japanese engineers who examined captured Hellcats after the war, when they could finally study the complete aircraft rather than fragments, and combat reports, expressed grudging admiration for the armament system. It was, they noted, not sophisticated. It was simply adequate guns in adequate numbers with adequate ammunition, installed in an aircraft capable of leveraging that firepower effectively. There was nothing exotic to copy or steal. The lesson was more fundamental and more disturbing. Winning required not brilliance but sufficiency applied overwhelmingly. Japan had pursued brilliance, creating the Zero, a fighter of extraordinary performance achieved through masterful engineering and weight reduction. America had pursued sufficiency, creating the Hellcat, a fighter of good performance backed by overwhelming firepower, protection, and industrial production. In the crucible of sustained combat, sufficiency applied overwhelmingly defeated brilliance every time. The 650 caliber guns were simply the most visible manifestation of that principle. By war's end, approximately 12,275 F6F Hellcats had been produced. Each one carried 650 caliber machine guns. Each one carried approximately 2,400 rounds of ammunition. If every Hellcat fired its entire ammunition load, the fleet would have expended approximately 29 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. That number doesn't count reloads, replacement ammunition, or rounds fired in training. The actual expenditure was far higher. Every one of those rounds represented American industrial capacity, material resources, and the deliberate decision to prioritize firepower over weight savings. Japanese engineers, examining the numbers, understood they had never stood a chance. Not because Japanese pilots lacked skill or courage, not because Japanese aircraft were fundamentally inferior in all respects, but because Japan had optimized for the wrong parameters. Maneuverability and range mattered less than firepower and protection when the war became a grinding attritional struggle. And 650 caliber guns, firing 4,800 rounds per minute, had proven that truth in the most brutal way possible. The legacy of the Hellcat's 6-gun armament extended beyond World War II. Post-war American fighter design would consistently emphasize heavy armament, with 6 or 8 guns becoming standard for propeller fighters and cannon armament for jets. The lesson had been learned thoroughly. In air combat, the ability to destroy targets quickly and reliably was worth almost any performance penalty. Soviet fighter design would follow similar paths, with later variants of aircraft like the Yak-3 and La-7 receiving increased armament after analyzing combat results. Even nations that had initially prioritized maneuverability over firepower began installing heavier weapons on their fighters. The philosophical shift was global and permanent. The Zero's approach, brilliant though it had been in 1941, represented the end of a design philosophy that would never dominate fighter aviation again. Every major air force had learned the same lesson Japanese pilots learned the hard way. You can't outmaneuver bullets, and volume of fire matters more than any other single factor in air combat lethality. For the American pilots who flew Hellcats, the 650 caliber guns became almost mythological. Reunions of Hellcat pilots' associations over the decades following the war consistently featured stories about the guns. Pilots would describe the sound, the recoil, the satisfaction of seeing tracers converge on a target and watching it disintegrate. They would describe the confidence that came from knowing your weapons could destroy any opponent reliably. They would describe how that confidence translated into aggressive tactics that destroyed Japanese aviation. One pilot, in an interview recorded in the 1990s when he was in his 70s, summed up the Hellcat experience simply, "We had good training, good tactics, good radar support, and a good aircraft. But what made us great was those 650s. Every time you pressed the trigger, you knew something was about to die. That's what winning feels like." The Museum of Naval Aviation at Pensacola, Florida, maintains several F6F Hellcats in its collection. One of them, restored to flying condition, is occasionally demonstrated at air shows. When the guns are test-fired on the ground, using blanks for safety, the sound is overwhelming even from hundreds of feet away. The 6 guns create a thunderous roar that physically impacts spectators, rattling chests and overwhelming conversation. That sound, amplified and focused in combat at 20,000 feet, was the last thing thousands of Japanese pilots heard before their aircraft came apart around them. It was the sound of American industrial might translated into firepower. It was the sound of engineering philosophy that prioritized destruction over elegance. It was the sound of war being won through overwhelming material superiority rather than brilliant improvisation. And it was the sound that ended Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force, one 2-second burst at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.